Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the show. Today I have with me Lisa Allen, and Lisa is the Director of Data and Services at the Open Data Institute. Lisa, welcome along to the show.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
No problem. And so we want to talk about how data assurance and trust can unlock value for organizations. So I'm looking forward to talking about that. Before we do, why don't we introduce you and your role and what it is you get up to?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm a data professional. I've worked mainly in government for many years. So I've worked at places like the Environment Agency, Ordnance Survey, Department for the Environment before coming to the Open Data Institute, which is a not-for-profit organisation. And we're mission driven. We want a world where data works for everybody. So one of the things I do at the ODI is I'm sponsor for our data assurance program. I've also got our data team. I've also got our consultants who help people to work with data better.
Brilliant. And yeah, well positioned to do that sort of focus in the way you do it at the Open Data Institute, which I'll abbreviate to the ODI for the rest of this, if that's all right. Because of your background, obviously you had a background in organization sort of being sort of focused on data leadership, focused on developing data strategies that deliver value, and you're sort of opening that up to the through this sort of social enterprise, charity, not for profit, to open this out to the wider world. So you have the scars and the craft from industry to really bring this home, right?
Yeah, definitely. I think when you work in any big organization, you really put your money where your mouth is, isn't it?
Mm,
And and you learn all along the way. I mean, I think some of the biggest lessons for me was when I worked at the Environment Agency. We released 2,000 data sets as open as one in 1 year as
right.
part of this work for the Secretary of State at the time for the Department for the Environment. So to challenge us to release 8,000 data sets in a year.
Yeah.
And before
What
that, the
what was the
Environment Agency,
significance of the 8,000?
it was just a number to challenge us to do things
Right.
differently.
Right.
So before that, the Environment Agency had only released 93 data sets.
Right.
So we ended up with a target of 2,000. So yeah, it definitely challenged us to do things differently.
Yeah.
So yeah, things like that really start making you think about how you manage your data and the social good and what comes out of it and how you manage risk as well.
Mm. Well, that all plays into building trust, which we'll come back to. But why is being open with data so important? Releasing as an organization, releasing it to the public or to other businesses. Obviously, at the mission that you have at the ODI, why is it such an important mission to make sure that data is sort of accessed in that way?
Yeah, so we talk about data as infrastructure. So we think it's like any other critical infrastructure, like your roads or your railways.
Right.
So if you could imagine that you put like tolls on every motorway, there are some with tolls on, but you wouldn't get very far if you were really just trying to restrict that for the few, not for the
Hmm.
many. So there are critical things in there that should be as open as possible.
Right.
And when you get openness, you get innovation as well. So some of the examples that came out of the Environment Agency work was like one archaeologist found 17 kilometres of Roman roads that he'd spent 40 years looking for.
Right.
Pretty amazing that you found that from the LiDAR data which we released, which was the terrain data. The LiDAR data also ended up in Minecraft. We never would
Okay.
have guessed that. I mean, we were using it for like flood assets and deciding where we were going to build them. So, and then somebody else used it for 3D art. So I think that just shows some of this openness. It's value can be greater than the organisation that has it. And if you
Mm.
can build that innovation and that sharing, but that does rely on, as you say, it comes back to trust.
Yeah.
And we know that all data can be open. So, we understand we talk about a data spectrum where you have closed on one side, we've got that personal data or national security. You've got the shared space, which may be like in research for health records and things like that. And then you've got the open space where, the risks have been mitigated and you can
Mm.
allow that innovation to be built upon there.
Love it, love it. And so let's talk about trust then. If a lot of that is obviously on the open side, and that's whether that's open very publicly or open even just within the four walls of an organization, because even within inside of four walls of an organization, you end up with sort of subsets of data that people can't access. But just generally, when my experience, when you open up data to people, there needs to be a level of trust about the quality of that data, the validity of that data, and all those good things. So trust is like, and it's quite theoretical and trust. So what is it? What are we talking about when we say trust and that people need to trust data?
I think you really started to shine a light because, like, data does flow within organisations, between organisations, to and from the public. Across
Yeah.
international borders, you've got that real flow there. So trust. I mean, there's probably lots of philosophers who've spent a lot of time thinking about trust,
Mm,
and that the hard bit is actually to put the parameters in there that can demonstrate that trust.
right.
So trust is important in the context. I think for us in our data context, you need to be thinking about it being the data being created, maintained between the parties who share it, collected and used in a certain way, and like mistrust between these groups of people sharing reduces the potential,
Mm,
for any value, the economic, social, or environmental it can generate.
right.
So if you start thinking about the different elements of trust, you've got like the credibility, the reliability, the competence. And some of the things there you were pulling out, like the reliability, you were pulling out some of the data quality things
Mm,
in there. And there's research. There's quite a lot of research in this area, so it's really interesting. So there's one by Gupta and Dami in measuring the impact of security, trust, and privacy and information sharing.
right.
And it was a study that was done in 2015. And it defined trust as a willingness of a party to be vulnerable to the actions of another party based on the expectation the other will perform a particular action.
Okay.
So you're like, okay, what does that
Okay.
mean? So you're thinking about, the ability, can you do it? The willingness, will you do it?
Yeah.
And then the motivation for you to do it. So,
Mhm.
and that's impacted as well by social norms. So it's impacted by drivers like reputation. It's also impacted by laws and regulations, and also the social and economic norms. So there's
Mm,
quite a lot in there, and I suppose that's why, like, when you think about trust, it's wider than just thinking about the data quality, because that's
yeah.
when you start getting into data ethics and social norms and how that's different around the world.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's quite a lot in there.
Well, we'll sure get to this, but of course, there's trust in the data, but as you say, the context is important. So whose data, who owns it, who's sharing it, who am I sharing it with, and that context might change. Even same data set shared or given by different organizations, for example, you might trust that more or less just because of the context of where that data's come from or going to. And I guess also just from what you're saying there, there's a cultural thing about how trusting is a culture, either geographically or again within organizations, and the cultural norms between people and entities that shape whether things can be trusted generally.
Yeah, and there's also around there that just because you're trusted doesn't mean you're trustworthy.
Hmm.
So if you
How do you
think
mean?
about the VW scandal with the emissions a few years
Yeah.
ago, they were a trusted brand,
Okay.
but their practices weren't trustworthy.
Ah, understand. Yeah.
So there's like nuances in when you're considering this too.
Yeah. Is there a difference, do you think, then, between and through the lens of data, particularly for the purpose of this discussion, but the organizations or particular groups of industries maybe that where we where there is less or more trust?
Yeah, definitely. And it's that old adage, isn't it? Trust is hard won and easily lost, isn't it?
Mm,
So there's a few pieces of research in this area. The ones that comes out quite well is normally the health sector,
mm.
which I think you'd expect because we all interact with the health sector.
Specifically
And
in the UK, this is, or
yeah,
just
so there's
generally?
some, yeah, in the UK. So there was an independent report on the public attitudes toward data and AI.
Mm,
And that was done by a tracker survey by the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation in March last year in 2022.
mm-hmm.
So that tracker showed that the NHS, pharmaceuticals, and research and academic institutions are trusted by more than half of the respondents to that survey.
Right.
And that echoes findings that we had as well. So we did findings back in a survey in 2019, and that revealed that 59% trusted the NHS and healthcare providers to use personal data about them ethically. And they were the only type of organisation trusted by more than half that were surveyed.
Right. But it's
So
still quite
that's,
low. I mean, 59% is actually relatively low overall,
yeah, well, we're
but
not
still the
compared
most
to,
trusted though.
it's still most trusted. I mean, when you
Right.
consider some of the others, so falling below 50% mark were central government at 30%.
Right. Wow.
Um, Local government was 31%. Banks and building societies were 42%.
Right.
So
What?
family and friends were 34%.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, that maybe is the benchmark, isn't it? So if you're better than family and friends, I think you're probably doing all right.
Yeah, yeah. And that most people, I mean, well, 44%, so it's not most, but just less than half felt that government and regulators should be most responsible. So there was definitely a heavier emphasis on the
Yeah.
expectation that
Well,
government should be better.
yeah, well, I think that's an important point, isn't it? That there's how much you trust an entity and how much you should trust them, and then your expectations of them. And you might have very high expectations and very low trust. So you have very high expectations that the bank should do the right thing, but you might actually have low trust that they will. As an example, we could have picked any industry there. Um, but interesting, sort of just going back to your healthcare that I think you said was the highest. You also
Mhm.
included pharmaceutical organizations, which in
Yeah.
my maybe slightly biased brain or lack of knowledge in this space would have thought that that would have been lower. You know, maybe because it's lumped together with healthcare, but sort of anecdotally, at least, you kind of expect. I would have expected the trust levels of pharmaceutical organizations, particularly I saw sort of during COVID and how open people were to sharing their data then was whether that was quite so high. So that's an interesting finding.
Yeah, and it could just be how the data's been categorized. So that's from the CDI tracker. So we can
Right.
always put a link to it.
Yeah.
So people can have a look at the research. But
Hmm.
not surprising, social media companies came out as 5% in the survey we did. So
Wow.
only 5% of people trusted social media companies.
Interesting. Well, that definitely comes back to then the expectations and but also interestingly, does it impact and change people's behavior? So you might trust TikTok, Twitter, Meta to a low level, but actually, does that change your behavior? Do you not use them because you don't trust them, or do you go, well, actually, to hell to it, I get a good service from this, it adds value to my life, therefore I'm still going to share it even though I don't actually trust it. So do you see, or have you tested, or have you seen any research that sort of correlates your level of trust and your actual engagement with that entity that you either trust or don't trust?
So I think this links into some of the things called digital resignation. So
Mm,
people know that
mm,
actually they're not that confident.
mm,
They're still sharing quite a lot of information, but they've got fear of missing out, or their kids' sports clubs, or
mm.
on certain platforms, so they end up using them anyway.
Right.
So digital resignation plays quite a big part, I think, in
So what's
there.
that? You're resigned to the fact that you have to share this data regardless of your views or opinions of where it's going.
Yeah, so yeah, you just resign to the fact that it's not going to be used in ways that that
You
you're
want.
100% happy with,
Yeah.
but you need their service to interact in society.
Yeah, that apathy is the worst of all worlds. It lets in some ways, they're not always big tech, I suppose, but it lets tech related services or products or companies sort of win in inverted commas, at the same time as reducing the trust and reducing people's emotional attachment to brands. It's kind of the worst of all worlds, really.
Yeah, and it's really hard to get people to switch over, because I know when there was the WhatsApp issue a couple of years ago, when they were
Mm,
updating their privacy policy, and for me, I know that made me switch totally. So I went on to Signal,
mm,
open source software, which I now pay for, rather
right.
than just taking for free too.
Mm,
Because if you're not paying for things, then you are the product in that case, and there's
mm,
somebody pays for a service. But even just in friendship groups, there were those who would switch and those that won't.
yeah.
And yeah, you just have to be quite strong on some of these. You have to be quite wedded to your opinion on it,
Yeah.
um, because digital resignation then comes in.
Yeah, it's all yeah. It's so I mean, yeah. Moving that forward, is there something we can do? Should we do something about that? Should we do something about that? Is this a bad place to be, and that's only going to get worse? This apathy towards, resign to the fact that this is just going to way the way it is. We don't accept that in other parts of our lives. So why should we? So is there something that needs to change there?
Well, sometimes it's about, if they're market failures, that's when normally government steps in to regulate, and government's meant to be there to try and balance some of those things, because there's only
Right.
so much we can do ourselves.
Yeah.
But actually, there's other areas where government can help, like the online safety bill that's coming through at the moment,
Mm,
is going backwards and forwards, and that's trying to regulate with the issues that's coming from from the use of the internet, and the impact of algorithms and transparency, and the impact it has on people's lives. With the
mm,
recent Molly Russell case, well, from a couple of years ago. Um, where a 14-year-old girl killed herself, and you're just like, it's quite deep to have, but that just shows where those algorithms were just promoting things that were really negative,
Yeah.
and who controls those things.
Yeah, I guess regulation is there to, in some instances, is there to get around the fact that people generally don't trust, and you want to sort of force the issue. I wonder if that actually changes the level of trust that people have, or whether it's just that the decision has been taken elsewhere to regulate something. It doesn't necessarily mean that my levels of trust interacting with something changes.
No, but it might put in place standards or guardrails to try and help with those where there are those market failures. So it may not mean that you trust anymore, but actually the amount of harm has been mitigated
You're
or tried to be
minimizing.
controlled.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're minimizing the impact that the issues that can come from a lack of trust, or indeed that trust being broken can give to the individuals or the people interacting. I mean, are there standards, frameworks, codes of conduct that help to maybe either in the absence of regulation or ahead of regulation coming, that will help to put something in place at least to support individuals and organizations in this space?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So I think in the data world, we have lots of standards, but in some ways we don't have enough, or they're not
Mm,
standardized or brought together. So,
mm,
you have your formal standards like data quality, your ISO 8000 and those sorts of standards. You've got your metadata standards, but there's lots of aspects here, and how you bring them all together. So we talk about a data assurance, and we just think about it as like the process or set of processes that increase confidence that data will meet a specific need,
right.
and that organizations collecting data and using are doing so in trustworthy ways. So we're like looking at them in two angles. So first of all, the data itself, and then the organization. But at the moment, I think regulation is struggling to keep up with, because the technology moves on so fast,
Yeah.
that it struggles to keep up with how that is, and what the guardrails need to be put in place then to boost that trust.
Right. And does that so I guess that leaves you in a position where at least we've got some guardrails, some standards that we can either hold at least ourselves to, but hopefully the technology companies, the organizations that we're sharing our data with, does that give us something to kind of pin to, some way of tracking, some way of managing these interactions?
I think we need to do more. So one of the things we're working on is like a data assurance code of conduct for organisations. So setting out what good looks like. So we're going to be
Right.
openly releasing our code of conduct in the spring. So that will help organisation know what good looks like. So it help point out some of those practices that they can look at. So are they looking at data ethics? Are they looking at data sharing? What are all the things they're doing, and how does it all come together? So it's not just focusing on, oh yeah, we've got a data team and they're doing some stuff. It's trying to say this is broad things that you should be looking at as an organization to demonstrate trust. And in the data set, we're looking at what are the things, including things like quality and data protection, all the things you'd expect in there, but also things like the ethics as well. So have you considered what data is in there? Is there any biases contained in there? Does it meet the specification? And then is there some way of badging or certifying that data that means it will help? So we're just doing that piece of work at the moment to come up with something later this year to try and help organizations tackle this, to look holistically, because it's quite a complex world, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And is it specifically, so you sort of you use the phrase data assurance. So this is
Mm-hmm.
giving a framework, giving some best practice around how you properly assess whether data can be trusted, but certainly assured, which is maybe something slightly different. But what's the sort of the scope of what it aims to do?
Yeah, so if you look at the data itself, it will be looking to see if it meets that specification and be trusted that it's meeting all of those things.
Mm,
There should be some way of being able to do like a gold, silver, or bronze for you to say, how much of the
like
criteria
a
is it
stamp.
meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then
Right.
you've got the other side of the organization, how much this is following. You could see that you could get to a world where you've got people going on a trusted organization with data. And that means, they've got all their data professionals trained, they're doing all the right practices.
Right.
And then there's some way of identifying that people are doing all that? Because at the moment, there's no way of knowing, is there? I mean, you guys, the same. You go into companies, you see some of the practices and things, but there's no way of knowing that from the outside.
Yeah.
So how can you demonstrate that?
Well, it's a good point. When you making a decision about whether you trust something, you're really only basing it on your own understanding. And if you don't have an understanding, it's based on perceptions. And your perception can be based on something very limited, a very limited interaction, a couple of news stories, or a something you read online somewhere, and it doesn't, you don't have the full picture, but yet you still make a judgment on whether you trust something, and that's based on your own biases and your own experience. So, is there what's the impact of not getting this right? We haven't really talked about that. So when we don't get assurance right, when we don't create the right level of trust, what's the impact that has on individuals or society more broadly?
Yeah, there's a few things here. So we talk about the world where in our theory of change where we want positive impact from data. So you
Mm.
can have on one side, that you get organizations hoarding. So you get them like a monopolistic, easy for me to say,
Yeah.
monopolistic position where they hoard that data for their own benefit, and you
Right.
don't get the social good. Then the
Okay.
other side of things, you'll get data fearing. So people or organizations won't share their data with others. So
Ah.
like if you don't share your data for research, you could be missing out on adding your data to the stuff that could help you in the future. Or you
Yeah.
might get certain marginalized communities that won't add, and then you'll end up with biases in the data. So from like societal point of view, that data fearing or data hoarding is really unhelpful for positive impact in the world.
Mm.
Um, there's also financial impacts. So some of the work we've done looked at by Frontier Economics found that in the UK, so if you share data between the public and private sector, it generates social and economic benefits between about 1 and 2.5% of GDP annually.
Wow.
So yeah, that's a quite amazing
Big
figure,
number.
and
Yeah.
obviously we like our figures, so we scaled it up. And if we look at the 20 largest economies in 2019, that would suggest that data sharing could unlock between $700 billion and 1.75 trillion in value globally.
Wow.
So it's
So that,
quite amazing. Yeah,
yeah.
you
So
have to pause and think.
you, you do, and that's specifically data sharing.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So if you're sharing your data, and when you think about originally what we spoke about, that sharing the data, the innovation that's coming from there, the efficiencies, the transparency, yeah, it's unlocking that value.
Yeah. So the impact of lack of trust is really, there's some financial, potentially financial impact. There's some, I guess there's some brand impact, when you're not a trusted brand with data. There's could be some brand damage there. But actually, I think a lot of what you're saying is you're sort of missing out on the upside that it could create. It's quite a nice way of looking at it. There's the potential for innovation, and potential for creating, something that's greater than the sum of what you can create within your own, four walls of your business. So it's really the potential that's being missed by not sharing, but also by having data that isn't trusted.
Yeah, especially when you think about like climate change, you're looking to share data across different sectors. You're looking at finance, you're looking at the energy, you're looking at
Mm.
environment, all the different sectors that need to come together to tackle some of the biggest issues we have. Um, that needs trusted sharing. You need that
Mm.
flow of data in well-governed ways, and people thinking about is that data infrastructure, and that
Yeah.
trust has to be there to make that work.
Yeah. I mean, data sharing becomes quite complicated, doesn't it? Particularly if you're, something like climate change, or even something like COVID, where actually there's a necessity to have access, share, hold, analyze data from lots of different places, lots of different data sets. And again, within one organization, that can be a challenge to kind of make sure you pull that together in the right way, make sure the results are quite trusted. So when you roll that up to, well, I'm a government organization trying to get a picture across health and social and individuals and digital and movements and traffic and all these things, there becomes a challenging complexity, a multiplier effect almost, when you take lots of untrusted data sets potentially and roll them up to be something that then needs to be trusted. Is there ways to kind of, to show that, that the output of this is positive rather than a bunch of untrusted data sets?
Well, I think it depends on what people are putting that trust and that specifications. And it's got to come back for people being much more formal about the way they're
Mm,
managing data. So
mm,
before Christmas, I went to Estonia. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Estonia model of their digital first by default. So I
right.
think even now in Estonia, you can get married online and divorced.
Okay.
I think you'd recommend meeting them first. But
Yeah.
but so everything you can do digitally. They're a small country, so 1.3 million people. So it
Mm,
could be the size of Birmingham or somewhere in the UK. So it's small, but they've got everything digitally everything digital. So each of their government departments has like the core reference data, so their data infrastructure for their area,
right.
and then they provide that to the others. So then it all flows between them. So you haven't got duplicated data sets. You haven't got that competing source of truth. You've
Mm,
got that trust. And a big part of that is also the security. So each of the citizens are have like three-factor authentication when you're getting into it. You can view what government department has used your data and what for. Obviously, there's
right.
exemptions like for things like if you're being investigated. But there's a level of transparency that's gone there, and
Mm,
now it's about protection. So they will see they back up their data infrastructure because that makes them vulnerable to cyber attacks and things.
yeah.
But you can see that as a template of architecture of how it all comes together,
Mm,
that's everybody's playing their part and the efficiency there.
yeah.
Yeah, you could see. Yeah, I think it will just take time for us in the UK to get to somewhere like that.
Certainly that comes back to the point about culture and trust. Maybe I don't know the Estonians that well, but maybe they have a very trusting culture and or have built that over time that allows them then to do this. Or it's the other way, which is use stick and this is force, this is how we're doing it, and you can't live in society without following these paths. And again, that's where I think we need guardrails. But really interestingly, you mentioned the word transparency, which sort of hadn't come up yet. And transparency, I think, is really important for building trust. Openness, honesty, transparency. And I think some of the industries that you talked about that have sort of lack of trust by society, I think some of that is because of a lack of honest and open and transparent communication and about what they're doing and how they're doing it and what they're particularly when it comes to individual personal data.
Yeah, and I think that transparency is so right. It is really firmly linked in for trust and engagement with your communities. And I know, like when I was doing that work in the Environment Agency, when we released like we were the team that released one of the first open data sets, and it was just our data catalog, and we knew it had issues in there. We knew it had quality issues. We knew that the data, some of it wasn't ours. We'd listed. We knew there were third parties. So when we put it out, we put out and said, you know what? We know we've got quality issues here. We know this is not just our data, it's others. Obviously, we
Mm,
weren't releasing the actual data, it was just a list.
right.
And these are the problems, but this is what we collected it for. And then we waited, for the world to go, oh, look at the state of that. But they didn't. They said, brilliant, 10 out of 10 for releasing it. They know they've got issues here and here and here. Can't wait to see the next iteration.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, you were open. People knew, and that allows people to make a choice about how much to use it, how much to rely on it, the results. But at least people have got it in their hands; they can make that choice. But if you hadn't been transparent and people had found that out, then they would no longer trust that data set, which is worse than releasing something that is not 100% or not complete.
Yeah, yeah. And in our research we've been doing on data assurance, actually, we found that the suppliers of data, there's quite they want the guardrails. They
Mm,
actually and they want the things to follow. They want to be able to talk publicly about those things. Interestingly, the users were happy to use data even if they were less worried about some of the assurance, which is a little bit worrying because it then does
mm,
show that you might end up using data that it was never intended for a certain purpose, or it might end up with skewed results.
yeah.
But if you can get the pressure though with the suppliers to say, no, actually, I want to make sure that I understand this area and the data I'm going to put out, you can be assured for these things, against the specification, then at least then the user has that knowledge of where it stands, and that's that transparency again.
Mm. Yeah, fascinating. Just thinking about kind of wrapping up, but the kind of where my mind goes is regulation. We were going all back to that really because you as a not for profit organization are doing this for the greater good. and that will get us so far, and it's fantastic work. And certainly from what I've seen previously from the ODI, always well received, and sets a really great baseline, a really great standard and best practice for some of these things. But I correct me if I'm wrong, that will only go so far until, same with ethics, that will only go so far until regulation comes in and says, here is the legal obligation that you have around this thing. Do you think that regulation is keeping up? And if it's not, then do you think we're on it? Is someone on this? Is someone trying to focus on making sure we have the right regulation, the right approach to data at a national level, the right focus on data from a security perspective, and those good things?
Yeah, so I think legislation struggles to keep up in this area because
Right.
technology keeps advancing, doesn't it?
Mm.
And it's going a faster pace than what the legislative cycle can go. And by the time you've got it through, then probably all the technologies change and there'll be different
Mm.
issues.
Yeah.
So I think there's definitely a part to play with legislation, but I also think that there's parts to play like with the code of conduct and how things move. So I
Mm.
think like ethics is an interesting one, isn't it? Because some of the things now are covered in the Data Protection
Yeah.
Act and how that's gone with GDPR. So that's been picked up in legislation, and now the things that are outside of it are being covered in the data ethics. There's going to come a time, I think, society will look at some of those things and actually want to shuffle them into legislation for when,
Mm.
those norms. But I think there's always going to be some of those. I mean, it's like I always think about it like the ice cube. You've got your solid center, but you've got the melt around the outside.
Mm.
Sometimes that melt is the bit that the regulation can't grasp.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can only grasp the solid part. So there's
Yeah.
always going to be that melt around the outside. So that's where I think it's got to be a balance between the regulations and then like the code of conduct, the informal things that can move a bit faster
Yeah.
until it then has to shift into the hard ice cube.
The hard part. I mean, yeah, but that balance between regulation that, as you say, can't keep up, but equally it needs to balance breadth with really specific sort of use cases and edge cases. So it's hard for regulation to be both broad and deep and keep up. So I think you're right. There's a part to play for kind of nudging forward. But I suppose the problem with codes of conduct and best practices is people, it relies on people want to get this right. And of course, there's plenty of people that are in that camp, but there's equally plenty of people that aren't, which is again where regulation keeps up. But yes, an ongoing treadmill, but a positive one, because it's all heading. The aim of it all is to head into the right direction. Where yes, you have data assurance, yes, you have trust, and yes, you have organizations doing the right thing by the individuals that interact with them and share their data. So great. Well, it's been brilliant having you on the show, Lisa. I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me, talking to us. For this episode.
Oh, great to be here. Thank you.
No worries, and we hope that was a great episode for everyone. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you again soon.